July 1940. Southern England, the hour before dawn. A pale mist clings to the hedgerows. Dew glitters on the grass like cold breath made visible. Somewhere beyond the trees, an engine coughs once, then falls silent. The air carries a hum, low and nervous. Every morning sounds the same now. Wind, birds, and waiting. Above it all, the sky holds its breath. Across the valley, farms sleep beneath thin veils of smoke. But these are not ordinary fields. What looks like haystacks hides something else. Canvas roofs stretch between oaks, shaped like barns from afar. A row of wooden carts stands by the lane, yet every wheel is hollow tin. To the untrained eye, England's countryside still lives its peaceful lie. A man in khaki climbs a ladder. He tightens the ropes of a great net draped through the trees. Leaves tremble as he pulls, the sound almost like distant applause. His name will never appear in any report. He is neither pilot nor general, but the war depends on his silence. Somewhere overhead, a faint buzz. Luftwaffe reconnaissance, early as always. He pauses, eyes upward. A silver glint crosses the morning clouds. Then the sound fades east, back toward France. He exhales. For a moment, the forest is only wind and heartbeat. Down the slope, shapes emerge in the half-light. Men pushing tarpaulin sheets over concrete runways, painting tire tracks where none exist. From above, it will look like farmland scarred by tractors. The deception is perfect only when seen from far away. That is its beauty, and its danger. Records from the Air Ministry speak little of these places. They were listed simply as satellite grounds. Yet behind those words lay entire airfields, hidden in plain sight. Each dawn, the same ritual. Engines tested under camouflage, airmen walking paths disguised as lanes between trees. The smell of fuel mixing with pine. The quiet discipline of those who fight by vanishing. A gull passes overhead. Its cry echoes against the netting. One of the men looks up, and for a heartbeat he sees his reflection in the false roof above him. A ghost beneath a ghost. This was the summer Britain refused to be seen. While German bombers searched for open targets, the Royal Air Force learned to disappear. From the coast to the Cotswolds, fields once known for wheat became fields of illusion. The nation's defense turned inward, from metal and fire to shadow and silence. No flags flew here, no songs were sung, only the rustle of leaves as men moved through the fog, and the sound of engines waiting to rise unseen into the sky. The light shifts. Mist turns gold. Somewhere deep in the woods, a propeller begins to spin, softly at first, then stronger, folding the morning into motion. And as the wind from that hidden engine stirs the canopy, Britain's secret begins to breathe. The sound of engines fades north. Only wind remains between the clouds and the coast. Now the view shifts, high above the channel. A Dornier patrol climbs through scattered mist, cameras fixed beneath its belly. Silver wings catch the rising sun, turning frost to fire. Inside, airmen lean over maps marked with red circles. They search for signs of Britain's strength. Airstrips, hangars, fuel depots, the pulse of a nation still standing. Each day they cross the same waters. Each day the same confusion returns. From this height, England looks ordinary. Fields, hedges, small roads curling between quiet villages. But the photographs tell another story. Shadows that do not move with the sun. Barns that change shape overnight. One officer frowns, tapping the film. "There should be a base here," he mutters. Another shrugs. The report will call it unclear agricultural use. On the ground below, the deception holds. The forest appears untouched, the nets invisible in morning haze. Even the footprints fade by noon. The camera clicks. One frame every 10 seconds. Mechanical, patient, blind. A lens recording a lie it cannot see. Back in Berlin, those same frames will fill a long wooden table. Analysts in uniform bend under white lamps, tracing outlines with pencil. Runways misread as farm lanes, camouflage taken for canopy. An empire of illusion growing across the English countryside. One photograph will trouble them, a faint line through the trees. Could it be a path, a drainage trench, a runway? No conclusion. The page is stamped unverified. The discovery loop closes quietly, the truth hidden in plain sight. To Germany's eyes, Britain seems unprepared. To Britain's heart, that misunderstanding is victory. At an RAF observation post, a corporal notes the passing shadow. He marks the hour, the direction, the altitude, routine precision. Then he looks out across the fields and for the first time notices how beautiful the lie has become. The hum of the German engines fades into the sea wind. Silence folds back over the land. Leaves sway, just leaves, nothing more. Evening light crawls through the branches, touching the nets with a dull copper glow. The forest exhales again, untouched, unseen, undefeated. And somewhere deep within that stillness, a mechanic's hands tighten the bolts on a hidden wing, as if sealing the day's secret before nightfall. The wind carries the echo of hammer blows, metal against wood, steady, patient, deliberate. In a clearing once used for harvest, men in overalls assemble the framework of a barn, but this one will never hold hay. Each beam measured to deceive the sky, each plank painted in shades of earth and shadow. The structure must look tired, imperfect, believable to the eye of an enemy. They work without banners, without rank distinction. Painters beside pilots, sculptors beside soldiers. Their orders come from a new branch of the Air Ministry, the Camouflage Directorate. It began quietly, inside the old Natural History Museum. Architects and artists gathered among the fossils, turning art into armor. They studied how light fell on leaves, how dust softened edges, how a curve could trick a lens. The lead designer once painted theater sets. Now he designs survival. He tells his team, a shadow must breathe like truth. Across the field, carpenters cut timber under canvas covers. They speak little. The work demands rhythm, not noise. Sawdust drifts like golden mist through the sunlight. A young artist kneels in mud, mixing green pigment with ash. He tests the tone on his palm. Too bright, too alive. Adds smoke water from the last air raid until it dulls to camouflage gray. Nearby, a sign reads simply, "Keep silence." Aircraft above, even whispers can betray position. They paint in silence, a gallery no one will ever see. Records show that by late 1940, over 200 such concealments were in progress across Britain. Runways disguised as country lanes, hangars disguised as hay barns, entire bases built to vanish at a glance. One engineer keeps a small notebook in his pocket. In it, sketches of tree branches aligned with roof lines, notes on wind direction, sun angles, the choreography of invisibility. He writes a single line under today's date. If they can't find us, they can't destroy us. By dusk, the field looks ordinary again. Only the smell of paint and petrol remains. Birds settle on rafters that are not real. Somewhere, a fox pads across a fake barn floor. The illusion is complete and alive. When the first reconnaissance plane returns, its pilot reports nothing unusual. And that phrase, nothing unusual, becomes the quiet victory of an invisible army. Night descends slowly over the forest. The tools are covered, the lamps dimmed. Men walk home beneath branches heavy with dew and secrecy. One of them stops, listening. Far above, bombers drone toward London. He removes his cap, silently counting their engines, then looks back at the forest, his forest, and whispers, "We're still here." The hum fades. Only the sound of the wind remains, threading softly through canvas and pine. Dawn again. Fog sits low, clinging to the pines. The forest breathes in rhythm with the machines below. Engines start, muffled, cautious, disciplined. Their sound doesn't rise. It folds into the wind. From above, the forest seems asleep. A line of men pushes a Spitfire from its shelter. Branches brush its wings. The camouflage so close it kisses steel. The pilot checks his watch, mouth tight, eyes calm. Every movement rehearsed, every sound accounted for. Fuel trucks painted brown roll through the shadows, their paths matching the lines of old tractor ruts. To the north, a small team tests the lighting grid. Lanterns hidden under leaves blink once, then vanish. From altitude, they appear like harmless farm lights, each bulb calibrated for illusion. Too bright, and the deception dies. Too dim, and the pilots can't return home. Somewhere in the control hut, a voice murmurs through static. Signal clear, runway green. Even the language of war has learned to whisper. The air smells of pine resin and aviation fuel. Frost gathers on tarps stretched above engine bays. A mechanic rubs his hands, breath clouding, then wipes the condensation from a gauge with his sleeve. He glances upward, sees only leaves. To him, that canopy is armor thicker than steel. Official records call it Station X4, Dispersal Field. Unofficially, it's known as the Green Cathedral. Here, faith is measured not in prayers, but in precision. When bombers pass overhead, men freeze mid-motion, tools still in hand. Only after the echo fades do they move again, like figures in a paused film returning to life. Each takeoff is a gamble. Engines roar beneath the trees, tires scraping moss, wings brushing branches, and yet they rise, disappearing into mist as if born from it. From the road beyond, a villager might hear only thunder underfoot, never guessing the storm it hides. That secrecy saves them all. In that silence lies survival. By afternoon, the air stills. A beam of sunlight pierces through gaps in the canopy, touching the wet fuselage of a parked fighter, its reflection rippling like breath over water. A corporal pauses to watch. He removes his gloves, runs a hand across the cold metal. His fingerprints vanish beneath a thin film of frost. He smiles. No one will ever know this place existed. The war outside rages louder every day. But here, inside the forest, time moves differently. Each hour defined by motion, restraint, and faith in the unseen. A crow lands on the camouflaged wing. It pecks once, unimpressed, then flies off into the pale winter sun. The pilot steps forward, engines ignite, a deep pulse rolling through roots and soil. Leaves scatter upward as the aircraft begins to move. For a heartbeat, light and shadow merge, and Britain's defense rises quietly beneath the canopy. Engines fade into the distance. Only a steady hum remains, the sound of film spooling. Somewhere in Berlin, a darkroom glows red. Photographs drip on metal racks, each one a frozen heartbeat of the English countryside. Analysts lean close, magnifiers trembling above glossy paper. They search for geometry, runways, fuel lines, shadow alignment. Each mark could mean life or death for hundreds of men. The chief interpreter, Major Kessler, adjusts his glasses. He traces a faint rectangle among the hedgerows. Here, he says, a landing field, or perhaps just plowed earth. He can't be sure. Light and shadow betray him again. The British have learned the language of deception. They speak it fluently, through sun angles and soil. At Farnborough, RAF analysts perform the same ritual in reverse. Aerial prints pinned to walls, cigarette smoke curling like tracer fire. They study their own handiwork, the camouflage, and smile at how convincing it's become. A female analyst, barely 20, adjusts the exposure with tweezers. She notes how the false barns cast perfect natural shadows. In her log she writes, "Deception depth, excellent." Then, a pause. She adds one more line, almost too real. The illusion now deceives even those who built it. Back in Germany, film reels travel by courier to the high command. Reports conclude, no major expansion of RAF capability detected. On paper, the lie becomes truth, and truth, invisible. The data loops back across the channel, fueling decisions, raids, and wasted bombs. Every strike that misses confirms the success of what cannot be seen. In one photograph, a shadow falls across a clearing. It seems like nothing, until you notice how it curves precisely where no tree grows. That shadow hides an airstrip. That curve is Britain's heartbeat. Each deception is handmade, crafted by artists who never sign their work. They mix mud with soot, light with silence, and the sky itself becomes their canvas. A veteran later recalled, "We didn't outgun them, we outpainted them." At night, the analysts turn off their lamps. The red glow fades, replaced by the low hum of machinery cooling. Someone coughs, someone sighs. The war continues, quietly, invisibly, through the lens. Outside, moonlight spills across the forest once more. The nets shimmer faintly, breathing with the wind. No aircraft move tonight, only the forest watching itself in silver light. The eye deceives, but the silence never lies. Night falls early that October. The air tastes of rain and metal. Somewhere beyond the coast, engines rumble like distant thunder. Men in the hidden airfield move with quiet precision. Lanterns dimmed, tarps pulled tight, every reflection sealed beneath cloth. In the operations hut, a radio crackles. Enemy formation, crossing the channel, 200 strong. The forest listens. Outside, darkness thickens until even outlines dissolve, only the faint drip of condensation from netting to soil. Then, a single flare, distant, blooming white over the horizon. Bombers incoming. The order is simple: no lights, no sound, no movement. But a mile east on an empty moor, another crew prepares the opposite. They ignite false fires, flicker lamps in dummy hangars, set smoke pots rolling through ditches. From the sky, it looks alive. The deception begins. The first bombs fall there, not here. Explosions tear open fields designed to die. Wooden mock-ups shatter, painted runways burn bright and useless. From beneath the canopy, men watch the glow rise over the trees. It looks close enough to touch, the illusion doing its work in flame and chaos. A mechanic murmurs, barely audible, "They've taken the bait." Above, the Luftwaffe pilots see what they expect. An airbase in panic, fires marking their aim. They dive, release, climb again into cloud. None suspect that the real base lies silent beneath them. One bomber drops its last payload and turns for home. Inside, the navigator marks the map with confidence. Target destroyed. Report complete. On the ground, nothing but leaves flutter. The hidden Spitfires remain untouched. Men breathe again, slowly, like surf receding after a storm. Records later counted over 200 bombs falling harmlessly on open farmland that night. A masterpiece of illusion measured in lives preserved. At dawn, rain drizzles over the scorched decoys. The smoke drifts toward the real forest, gray against green. A corporal steps from the shadows to watch. He can smell the fire, but the airfield stands intact, engines unscarred. He closes his eyes, letting the rain wash soot from his face. Somewhere behind him, a pilot prays in silence, his hand resting on the wing that might not have survived. For the first time, they understand what their camouflage truly means. Not hiding from fear, but creating the silence in which courage can live. By midday, the illusion fields are rebuilt. New decoys shaped from yesterday's ashes. The cycle continues, deception feeding defense night after night. The war moves north, but the lesson remains: the unseen can shield the living. As evening returns, the forest breathes again. Engines whisper, leaves glisten with moisture, and above them, the sky, vast, cold, and briefly merciful, reflects the last flicker of fires that never truly were. The forest sleeps after fire, rain beads on canvas roofs, sliding down into silence. Inside a small hut, maps dry beside a coal stove. Ink stains the wood, green, brown, shadow gray. The colors of survival. These men and women are called camoufleurs. Painters turned engineers, architects turned illusionists. They build nothing that lasts, yet everything that matters. Julian Trevelyan sits by the window, sketchbook open. Once he painted rivers. Now he sketches fake barns from memory, each line a wall between life and death. Hugh Casson checks a model of an airfield. His fingers trace miniature hangars made of card and glue. He whispers, "They'll never see it." And that, he knows, is the highest praise. At the Natural History Museum in London, corridors once lined with fossils now hold camouflage models. Elephant bones share space with papier-mâché runways. Science and art merge under blackout curtains. No one outside these rooms will ever know their names. Their victories carry no medals, only the quiet relief of what never happened. A letter lies open on the desk, edges burned, words blurred by rain. We build to disappear. That is our duty, to keep others from vanishing instead. The letter is unsigned. Perhaps that's fitting. Their work erases ego as it erases visibility. Records show that by 1942, Britain's deception network spanned hundreds of square miles. Wooden aircraft parked on false runways, rubber fuel tanks beside rivers that did not exist. An empire of shadows maintained by human hands. One painter recalls, years later, "We painted with mud, but we painted hope." Outside, snow begins to fall. It settles on the nets, softening every hard line. The airfield beneath grows quiet, almost holy. Trevelyan closes his sketchbook. Casson turns off the lamp. Only the stove glows faintly red, light trembling across their tools. Through the window, the forest looks untouched again. The camouflage has claimed even the memory of its makers. A corporal passes by, saluting the hut as he would a chapel. Inside, no one speaks, only the gentle hiss of rain and graphite on paper. At dawn, they'll start again, repainting, reshaping, reimagining. The war demands invisibility. They answer with creation. Outside, the first light returns, pale, forgiving. The snow melts where it touches steel, and for one brief moment, the airfield breathes as art. Smoke from the stove fades into morning haze. Overhead, clouds drift low, heavy with the scent of snow and fuel. Across Britain, the illusion spreads. From Norfolk to Wales, from the Downs to the Clyde, every valley now hums with secrecy. Convoys carry timber, canvas, and wire through narrow lanes. The paperwork lists them as farm structures, the reality, another ghost field waiting to be born. By spring of 1942, over 400 dummy airfields existed, each mapped with military precision, each alive only through the imagination of those who built it. To the enemy, Britain seems endless, a land of false reflections where no photograph agrees with another. A truck driver recalls one night run to a decoy site near Exeter. He followed dim markers through mist, unaware the glow ahead came from painted fires. When he arrived, no people, just warmth and silence. He realized then, the war had learned to lie beautifully. At the same hour, in Berlin, analysts grow uneasy. Their reports contradict. One says RAF expansion minimal, another, airfields multiplying weekly. Truth dissolves in the fog between them. Each deception field has its own personality. Some mimic rural estates, others industrial yards. One near Lincoln even breathes smoke from hidden chimneys, a mechanical heartbeat pumping life into illusion. In London, the Camouflage Directorate expands to include physicists. They study light scatter, infrared reflection, radar echo. The science of invisibility evolves into art with equations. A note from the archives reads, "Paint absorbs radar better when mixed with ash." Another line beneath, "Beauty is defense." Out in the countryside, villagers learn to stop asking questions. They pass by men digging shallow trenches, laying cables to nowhere, and pretend not to see. War has turned sight itself into a weapon. From above, the pattern looks almost organic, like veins spreading through the land, each field connected by roads that lead to both nowhere and everywhere. A pilot flying home from a mission once mistook a decoy for the real base. He landed safely on what should have been an illusion. The engineers laughed, then took it as proof. Their art had surpassed intent. The deception network no longer hides just planes. It hides factories, rail yards, even radar sites. Some glow at night, like dying embers to draw bombs away. Others remain dark, invisible sanctuaries beneath cloud and moon. Each false light means another real life spared. Each empty ruin tomorrow means one family intact. By late 1943, Britain itself has become a stage set. From the sky, truth and trickery blend, until even the gods might hesitate. And in that uncertainty, safety blooms. The war still burns on distant fronts, Africa, Italy, the Atlantic. But here, in the misted isles, the art of hiding has become the art of endurance. As dusk falls, the lights of a decoy field blink to life, faint, flickering, perfectly timed. From afar, they seem to breathe. And as the wind shifts through the forest, Britain exhales a single, quiet truth. Sometimes, to defend what is real, one must perfect the unreal. Dawn over southern England again, brighter, louder, sure of itself. The forest still stands, but the silence feels different now. Engines warm openly on runways once hidden. Pilots no longer creep through fog. They march across tarmac in daylight. The air hums with confidence. By mid-1904, the Allies own the sky. New concrete airfields sprawl across the coast, each one feeding the invasion that will break Europe's grip. Yet deep in the old woods, the camouflage nets still hang. Weather-worn, torn, green fading to gray. Beneath them lie runways long unused, their tire marks softened by moss. A single jeep rattles down the overgrown path. Inside sits an RAF engineer, one of the first camoufleurs. He hasn't been back in years. The war has moved east, but his memories still live beneath the leaves. He parks by the old operations hut. The door creaks. Dust floats in light slanting through a broken panel. The maps on the wall remain, corners curled, pencil lines showing where the fake barns once stood, where real bombs never fell. He runs his fingers across the paper, feeling every name erased by time. Outside, the air is full of sound, planes forming up for Normandy, waves of engines rolling like thunder toward France. He closes his eyes, listening. That rhythm, so familiar, now means something else, not defense, liberation. In London, planners draw new lines across the channel. The same deception artists who once hid airfields now design phantom armies, inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, entire divisions that exist only in the enemy's imagination. Operation Fortitude, born from the same quiet genius that once hid planes beneath trees. Camouflage reborn as strategy. A note in the archive reads, "The best trick is not to vanish, but to make the enemy look the wrong way." By June 6th, the lesson is complete. While false convoys sail north, the real invasion lands at Normandy, and the tide turns for good. Back in the forest, rain begins to fall, soft, steady, forgiving. Drops strike the faded nets with a rhythm like applause. The engineer kneels, brushes away leaves from a slab of concrete. There, barely visible, the white paint of a runway number. He traces it with his thumb, whispering, "We made it invisible, and it saved the world." He stands, watching light filter through the canopy. The war's roar moves farther away, leaving behind only wind and the smell of wet soil. In that moment, he realizes the camouflage was never just to hide machines. It was to protect the fragile heartbeat of a nation until it could rise again in open sky. As the clouds part, a formation of bombers passes overhead. Their silver wings catch the sun, casting moving shadows over the trees that once hid them. The forest bows in silence, a final salute to the ghosts who guarded it. The forest endures. 80 years later, its branches still knit the same sky. The hum of engines is gone. Only birds now trace the air. From above, satellite images reveal faint shapes beneath the canopy. Outlines of runways, forgotten service roads, the geometry of a vanished war. Tourists pass by unaware. Children play where fighters once slept beneath leaves. Moss covers the concrete, soft as memory. A historian walks the old perimeter with a metal detector. It hums once. A nail, a bolt, a fragment of netting. He pockets it gently, as if touching a heartbeat long cooled. The air is peaceful now, but when wind moves through the pines, it still sounds like propellers turning somewhere far away. Archival letters tell of those who never returned. Camoufleurs buried without honors, pilots whose names faded with the paint they trusted. No monuments mark their work, only trees. One oak near the center bears a scar, a pattern of burned bark where a decoy once flared. Through that wound, new leaves grow each spring. Nature keeps the memory the way soldiers kept watch, quietly. Some evenings, the light falls just right, and for an instant, the old lines of the runway reappear, silver in the grass, a ghost of flight returning home. A local farmer says he still feels it. Sometimes, when the wind's in the east, you can hear engines that aren't there. He smiles, tips his hat, walks on. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps the forest remembers more than we do. Records now rest in the archives, brittle, yellowed, the ink fading like the sound of distant aircraft. Each page a whisper from a time when silence was stronger than steel. They fought without glory. They built beauty to protect what was human. And when the sky cleared, they simply stepped back into the crowd and disappeared. The forest stands as their monument. No speeches, no parades, only wind, light, and gratitude. Because in the end, they did not fight to be remembered, but so others could forget the fear. For those who came home, freedom was not a word. It was a promise paid in silence. And in that silence, Britain's hidden airfields still breathe, alive only in memory, alive forever beneath the trees.